All right. Well, I am here with Tal Havivi of ISTE. How you doing, Tal?
I am happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks for coming. To start, could you just kind of tell us about your role at ISTE and the work that you do at ISTE?
Yep. So I'm the managing director of research and development at ISTE. ISTE actually merged with another member-based nonprofit called ASCD. So now we have alphabet soup of a name, ISTE/ASCD. Um, and my role is I support the development and impact of high quality learning tools. So that looks like a few different things. One is both doing research on what does good look like in the ed tech sector, really from a product perspective. What does good ed tech features, functionality mean? Implementation, what does it look like? Educating, so that both the research piece and then taking that research and applying it into the real world. So we have a
Hmm.
program development team. Part of it is focused on a product certification called the SDCL, which is evaluating the technical and pedagogical usability of tools. So, from a teacher perspective, does it does a ed tech product support, enable, guide um, high quality instruction, research backed instruction? And then also, is it technically usable, like the way
Mm.
you technically use your iPhone? Um,
Yeah,
we also have a solutions network, which is just a community that's really built to support ed tech providers who are interested in exploring and understanding best practices of teaching and learning. Right, the education has some K-12 education in particular has some persistent, gnarly problems and
mm,
challenges ahead, um, and it's going to require a lot of different organizations to support addressing those challenges, ed tech providers being one of the primary ones. In order for ed tech companies to play a meaningful role, I think there needs to be more conversation around what does good really look like
sure.
all the way through. What does good instruction look like? What really are the problems that
Mm.
our school systems are facing? So having a space for that and sort of creating that feedback loop between ed tech providers and the school districts that they serve. And
Sure.
then the third thing is the product index. It's our last sort of program, which is a K-12 ed tech catalog where um, K-12 decision makers will go to discover, evaluate, and compare ed tech tools with all of the market validators that exist.
Sure.
Um, so they can search for an ed tech product and they see here are the interoperability badges, here are the student data privacy badges, here's the research badges, all in one place to
Mhm.
support their decision making for buying good ed tech.
Mm. Yeah, you mentioned this idea of like you want to ensure that ed tech products are in line with the current research of what is most effective. And I would imagine, given the conversations I've had with other folks who are doing this research, that's changing really quickly. So I would imagine you kind of have to be on your toes with that as well. What are some of the trends you're seeing in the ed tech field right now?
Yeah, I mean, directly address your question. I think there is both like cutting edge research that is pushing the boundaries of what we know about what how people learn.
Mm,
And there's not cutting edge research that
mm,
still hasn't made its way into edtech implementation.
okay,
So it's
yeah.
sort of finding that median. In terms of some of the major trends that we're um, seeing right now is evidence is just becoming so much more important, both because it's standing in its own right, people are starting to really recognize the value of it, but also with COVID funding at most school districts coming to an end later this year, they're really trying to brace themselves and prepare themselves for what are the core components of our edtech ecosystem, because we have really allowed a ton of things in over the last 4 years, a lot of edtech products in over the last 4 years for various reasons, and I'm not saying that that was a bad thing to do,
Sure.
but now there's sort of this strategic culling that has to happen now.
Interesting. Yeah.
And so we're seeing a lot of school districts trying to understand what's the language I need to learn to
Mm,
articulate what high quality means for me.
yeah.
Um, Said another way, like evidence of impact is really important. And there's a lot of decision makers who are saying that is really important, but what works in this school district doesn't necessarily mean
Mhm.
it works in that school district or in my school district. So, how do I sort of own this language in a meaningful way? So, there's sort of this influx of learning. How do I actually evaluate good ed tech?
Sure, yeah. It reminds me, from a different perspective, it's very similar to the work that the Educating All Learners Alliance, ELA, is doing. A lot of what we think about is the accessibility of a product, the um, is this an inclusive practice? Um, and it reminds me of what you're saying, that, if it works over here, it might not work over here. Um, and, whether it's from an accessibility perspective or just in the broader ed tech space, what are some changes that you'd like to see moving forward?
Yeah. I mean, from an accessibility perspective, I think that so many ed tech providers and district and school districts are um, it is such a daunting task to say, like, to get to the point of saying this product is fully accessible.
Yeah,
Their accessibility is so complicated and runs deep because the unique needs of students are unique and different and wide and varying, um, which is wonderful and hard to build for. Um, so one of the things I'd like to see is just taking a step towards accessibility, right? Not
yeah.
necessarily saying we have this fully covered for every student, which, by the way, like no product has, and maybe
Mm,
we'll never really be able to address the needs of every student, but taking some first steps. So, for example, there's so many ed tech products right now that have embedded video that just doesn't have closed captioning,
mm,
right? That is an easy, small thing that a
sure.
lot of companies just don't do right now because it's not top of mind. And um, what would make it top of mind is if school districts said, this is important to us.
Mhm.
So I think there's both a sort of procurement education or evaluation education for school districts to say, we want, we want accessibility, but even more so saying we want accessibility. And these two or three things are really important to us
Yeah.
because that makes it actionable and it sort of gives the pull that a lot of ed tech vendors might need in order to reprioritize a roadmap and make that investment. For example, we um, just in December of last year, so 2023, um, the ISTE seal was included in LA Unified's RFP for supplemental instructional tools. And when we saw that it was included, we weren't involved in that, but when we learned, the reason we learned that that had happened was because we had an influx of interest from vendors who said,
Mm,
we need to know about the SDCO. We need to know about the SDCO. And I share this in that, like, I think that is at least the natural behavior and a natural pattern of things where ed tech providers are primarily motivated by what their districts ask for,
sure.
especially as it relates to doing business with that organization.
Yeah. Strikes me as a really interesting sort of supply and demand dynamic there, where, um, I've heard from educators that, well, to it's hard to think about accessibility when it's not really available in this product or that product. But also, from what you're saying, it sounds like, ed tech vendors are saying, well, if we don't know there's a demand, then why would we build in these accessibility features?
And I think we've learned that, like, even when there are laws mandating
Mm,
accessibility features, if they're too complicated for a school district to enforce,
yeah,
then they sort of, even then they'll get ignored.
yeah. I wonder, if from that educator perspective, I wonder, um, do you have any thoughts around someone who's just starting to think about this, who's looking to broaden, the accessibility of their teaching? If you have any tips or first steps for them.
Yeah, I think having clear definitions around, like, what does accessibility mean, and what does inclusivity mean?
Mm,
And then you can create both from those two standpoints um, design principles, right? Like something that I've seen a lot of is um, there are a lot of ed tech products that don't necessarily make it easy for a student to see themselves in the product,
mm,
or the authentic learning is not really authentic to many students, right?
mm,
Over 50% of public school students in the United States now are black and brown, and there's a lot of ed tech products that don't have any black and brown
mm,
children as
mhm,
characters in their products. So like just starting with those design principles, and then I think also learning like what are one or two things that don't mean that I'm fully accessible, but are steps towards accessibility. And being able to just make those quote unquote like small bets will
sure.
be able to help help an ed tech provider learn the value of it, right? How many people are using closed captioning? Um, can I slow down the speed? Can I speed up the speed of the product? So
Mhm,
understanding like what are a few of those product features that you can just start with
sure.
so that you can sort of put yourself on a path.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea that, um, I guess you could say, that representation itself can be something like an accessibility feature that allows the student to more deeply engage with the material.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they're paired. They're not like accessibility. There are clear, right? There's clear guidelines. There's like the
Sure.
WCAG guidelines, and I think from a design perspective, in terms of thinking about like what are the philosophical design pieces of your product, inclusivity pairs nicely with accessibility because there are parts of accessibility that really open up inclusivity, and there's parts of inclusivity that really open up accessibility
Mm,
design principles.
yeah. So they work in tandem to bolster each other. Yeah. So so part of ELA's primary work is to helping to create what we call a pathway to possible for educators and organizations across the country. Um, and I wonder what resources or supports are you seeing that advance the possibilities for students with disabilities? Whether on the forefront or just things that are being taken up in greater numbers that are helping people out right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think one part is just an education around um, like product, what makes products that are more accessible. So on the product index, for example, um, we have an accessibility badge through CAST that they've developed and now have put on the product index. So when a school district is looking to, or an educator is looking to evaluate, hey, I want to evaluate four formative assessment tools. I can see which ones of them have gotten this third party validation,
Sure.
in this instance through CAST. Um, and then that means something to them, right? They say, okay, like I know that this was designed with UDL. I know that it has at least a higher probability of meeting accessibility needs in my classroom.
Yeah.
Um, so that's one example. And then I think like just understanding who are these ed tech intermediaries who are doing this work and what does the
Hmm.
work mean for me as an educator is meaningful, whether that's CAST, whether that's digital promise and the research based evidence, um, so product certifications, the project unicorns, interoperability certifications. There's a lot of like One Ed Tech and um, the student data privacy pledge that have student data privacy product certifications, and then the SDCL, which is really around the teacher usability of a tool. Those are all, I think, meaningful market signals, market validators for educators to understand. Like, here are ways, here are organizations that are here to support me make good ed tech decisions
Mm.
that I can then use to inform my instruction, inform the infrastructure in my classroom so that I can teach to the needs of my students. Was that your question? I don't know if I answered your question.
I think so. It was a sort of open ended question. So yeah, absolutely. Um, so obviously we've been discussing the needs that drives these accessibility features and innovations. Um, and I just wonder, in a general sense, where do you see um, this going in the future? The possibilities of either the tech itself, or just the kind of the best case scenario of what this does to education in the future.
Um, I think every time you ask this question, you're going to get some sort of AI related response.
Okay. Yeah.
And so I'll start with an AI related
Great.
response. I think the worst case scenario is that we talk about personalized learning in a way that doesn't actually personalize learning in a
Mm,
meaningful way. Um, so, said another way, there's a lot of promise right now for generative AI to personalize learning and to, for level it at different reading levels and for content. And that's really amazing to think about. But if it's not done in a way that's high quality or really research backed, it doesn't actually improve student outcomes. Right. So there's, I think, in a best case scenario, there's a way to actually evaluate with generative, like whether the generative AI is personalizing in a way that's high quality. Right. There's sort of this in today's world, I think there's a tension between, is generative AI making teachers' lives more effective,
mm,
or is it sort of the tension between like effectiveness and quality, right? Like I can grade classroom essays a lot faster now,
mhm.
but is it actually providing meaningful feedback to improve student outcomes? Like those are
Sure.
sort of the tension between the two. And I think the sort of operational efficiency is um, the first thing to come,
Mhm,
and it'll happen universally in every one of its fields. But the things that are harder and more unique to education is like the learning design, the digital pedagogy.
mhm.
Is the data that's being fed back actionable data for a teacher in the context of a modern day classroom? Um, so I think there's a lot of work to do around what does quality mean in terms of
Right.
the uniqueness with education there. Will you ask the question again?
Yeah, just about this, where in the best case scenario, where what does this do for education in the future? And how does that look different than where we are now or where we've been?
Yeah, I think there's sort of like a traditional classroom and a um, sort of a student centered classroom that is not a traditional classroom. And what I'd love to see is more schools move to a student centered
Sure.
classroom model. And with that, there is a lot of like a lot more of the ELA work, right? Like how do we talk about accessibility? There's also more around inclusivity. Um, a lot of it is more around modern day research, like the science of reading.
Well,
Um, those are things that require behavior change and pedagogical shifts
yeah.
for big swaths of our teacher workforce in the United States. And I'm hopeful to see those changes happen, both organic, from a bottoms up approach where educators say, I want to change the way my instruction works. But there are limitations, there are constraints. Some in some instances they are not allowed to do that.
Hmm.
Um, and from a district's tops down approach to have leaders who really want to move classroom learning from what it is today to intentional and strategic behavior shifts and pedagogical shifts all the way at the classroom level, that lead to a more personalized approach, that lead to more research backed pedagogical practices, um, and with that, like really clear understanding and articulation of ed tech products and what is the role that they will play in this modern day classroom.
Mm. Well, I think that wraps up our conversation nicely. I really appreciate your time, Tal. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me.